So what's the very first thing an editor or a writer needs to do? Well, the very first thing they need to do is to figure out what genres their story is going to be a part of. And what is a genre? A genre is just a very fancy word classifying every story ever told since the beginning of time. That's really all it is. And the classifications are all about managing audience expectation, which is just a fancy way of saying what exactly is it that you're going to want to know before you read a book or watch a television show. These are all the things that marketers and advertising people put on covers of books and on movie posters. And the classic genres are things like the crime genre, the mystery genre, the love story, the science fiction story. These are all those things that a lot of literary people kind of turn their nose up of. But every single story has a genre. The way to really wrap your mind around it is to figure out what do I need to explain and deliver to an audience. And there are 5 major categories of genre. Time, we're going to want to know how long am I going to have to sit through this movie, or how long am I going to have to read this book. There's structure. Are we going to see the hero's journey, which is called an arch plot, or are we going to see a mini plot or an anti-plot? The third is style. Is it going to be a drama? Is it going to be a comedy? Is it going to be literary? The fourth is reality. How much am I going to have to suspend my disbelief? Is this going to be like The Lord of the Rings, where there are magical creatures, or is this going to be very realistic, like a biography? And the fifth category of genre is called content. Now, content is the one that we all think of when we think of genres. When we say crime story, we know exactly what we're talking about. When we say love story, we know what that is too. Now, there are 2 kinds of content genres. There's the external genre, and there's the internal genre. And the external genre are all those things that I just mentioned, like crime, horror, thriller, action. And the internal content genres are those that are more literary, the coming-of-age story, the worldview, the morality story, the punitive story, the redemption story. You don't necessarily need both external and internal in your content choice. There are plenty of murder mysteries that don't have any internal genre whatsoever. For example, Agatha Christie stories. We read those stories because we want to be in the presence of a master detective who solves an amazing crime. We don't really care if he changes as a human being at the beginning of the story versus the end. But a story like The Silence of the Lambs, that's a critical story that has both the external thriller genre category, and it also has the internal disillusionment plot of the lead character. So just to take a step back, what I've done is I've created something called the 5-leaf genre Clover, so that it can remind me whenever I need to look at a story and help a writer discover the problems, I need to categorize all of the specific genres that they are working in. So I created this Clover that has all 5 of the genre subcategories. And it's important to remember you have to make one choice, at least one choice from each of these categories. So, for example, The Silence of the Lambs, let's take that example. The time genre is long. It's a long novel, pretty simple. The structure is arch plot, which is what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, which is basically the arcing of a story where the character moves from one place and ends up another. The style is drama. It's not comedic in every way. Real emotional terrain is on display in the story, and it's very, very chilling and thrilling. The reality structure is realism, in that we believe exactly in the institution of the FBI in this story from beginning to end. Now, Thomas Harris was a journalist, so he puts all the details, and it's richly layered. So we believe that the FBI is exactly as he discusses in the novel itself. So that's realism, and that's the reality genre. Now, the content genres are serial killer thriller as the external genre, and worldview disillusionment as the internal genre. And I can get into those much later on in the story. The important thing is that you have to make at least one choice in each of the 5 categories. So a question I get a lot is, why do I have to make these choices of these genres? What are they going to do for me as a writer? Why do I have to be so specific about what category I'm using and all of that? And the reason is that, as I said at the beginning, genres manage your audience's expectations of your story. What that means is that if I say to you, hey, I've got this great mystery novel that I've written, and there's no body at the very beginning of the story, that's going to disappoint you. Because in a mystery, there are conventions and obligatory elements that you have to have in there, or people aren't going to enjoy the story. Now, what is a convention and obligatory scene? For example, in a thriller, there are about 5 to 7 must-haves in your story. You must have a speech in praise of the villain. You must have hero at the mercy of the villain scene. You must have what's called a MacGuffin, which is the thing that the villain wants above all things. It could be the nuclear codes. It could be, in the case of The Silence of the Lambs, a suit, a woman's suit for a very deranged man to wear. That's a MacGuffin. It also has to have a clock, meaning there has to be a moment of time where if the hero does not win, all bets are off and the villain wins. It also has to have what are called red herrings. What a red herring is a clue that misdirects the hero from finding out the truth about what's going on. There's one more, clues. It also has to have very, very specific clues that are usually put in and seeded at the very beginning of the story and don't pay off until much later on. So those are things that you must have in a thriller, and if you don't have them, the audience isn't going to like your story. So a lot of people say about obligatory scenes and conventions in particular genres, isn't that kind of cheesy? Isn't that kind of, like episodes of old Mannix reruns from the 1970s? Well, the reality is you need to have a map, and your obligatory scenes and conventions are so crucial because you're not going to be able to get to the end of your story unless you hit those specific points. For example, in The Silence of the Lambs, somebody says to me, well, there's no hero at the mercy of the villain scene in Silence of the Lambs. Well, that's absolutely untrue. It is brilliantly created by Thomas Harris, and it's the very climax of the entire novel. And if you've seen the movie, in the moment when Clarice Starling has to go into that basement and it's completely dark, and the bad guy, Buffalo Bill, has on the goggles so he can see in the dark, that is the hero at the mercy of the villain scene. He can see her, she can't see him. Now that was a brilliant way of delivering an obligatory scene in a very unique way. Now what separates the pros from the amateurs as writers is being able to use these conventions and obligatory scenes in very unique and specific ways that nobody has done before. So the challenge is, no, I'm not going to do it. The challenge is to do those obligatory scenes and conventions in a way that has never been done before, so that the audience is completely surprised and captivated by the way you handled what you must have in your story. So now that we have a handle on genre, let's take a look at the foolscap global story grid and the macro editorial point of view in the next video. So the most important thing to do as an editor when you're beginning is to figure out what's the beginning hook, the middle build, and the ending payoff of this 400 pages of manuscript. Now's the time to do my foolscap method, which is exhaustive. It's like a mechanic opening up the hood of a car and checking it all out when you're getting your car inspected.